You keep 2 sets of books, one for the tax office, the other one for yourself. August Kowalski said it at 1 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, when the September sun came pouring gold through the front window and lay in a long, bright stripe across the oak counter Margit Vass's grandfather had built in 1979. The lunch crowd had just thinned out. She was squaring up a stack of menus, and she didn't startle. She set the menus down, slowly, and that got his attention more than screaming would have. The second one says you're 42,000 short. Margit looked up, tilting her head slightly to the right the way people do when only one ear works properly. The sun was full in her face and she didn't squint. Where did you get that number? From where you left it. Then what do you want? In Federal Hill, people did not ask August Kowalski that question. People waited for him to speak first, then calculated how much time they had left. He had sat in this last stool 7 times in 6 weeks, always with his back to the door, always paying triple the bill, and the first time, she had followed him out into the noon sun to hand back the difference. Nobody had handed money back to him in years. Now she stood a counter's width away, 27 years old, freshly out of a teaching job, to keep a 12-seat restaurant. The whole neighborhood had already bet against surviving the winter. He was 34. He knew exactly what he had just said, and he knew even better what he hadn't. What do you want? She asked again. Outside, a delivery truck went by. The stripe of sunlight on the counter shifted a little further along. Then August Kowalski said the thing he had not said to anyone in the 14 months he had held that chair. I don't know. But before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Do you believe a man who has done a great many wrong things can still love someone the right way? Leave your answer in the comments. I'd truly like to hear it. If you think this story is worth staying for, drop a like and share it with someone you think would understand. And if you'd like more stories like this one, subscribe. We're here every week, one story at a time. Now, let's get back to August and Margit. August rose from the chair at the end of the counter. He took out his wallet, counted the money, and placed on the wooden surface exactly the amount written on the bill. Not a penny more. Margit looked at the stack of money, then at him, and for one very brief second, she was about to say something, but he had already turned away. He didn't say goodbye. He reached the door, paused for a beat, as though he had just remembered something, then pushed it open and stepped out into the sunlight. She stood still behind the counter and watched him through the glass pane. He didn't turn right toward the harbor like he always did. He walked straight ahead, slowly, with both hands in his pockets, and she saw him stop at the corner long enough for a woman selling flowers across the street to stop wiping the glass and turn completely back inside the shop. Then he disappeared. Margit remained there for another while. The patch of sunlight on the counter had crept toward the stack of money he had left behind. She didn't pick it up. She bent down, opened the drawer beneath the cash register, and took out the second notebook. It was a blue, worn graph paper notebook, the kind her grandfather had used since the 80s, and she had kept it because she couldn't bring herself to buy a new one. She opened it and turned from the first page, slowly, following the habit she had built over 4 years of grading papers. When she reached page 11, she stopped. In the upper right corner of the page was a small fold, neat, sharp, the kind of fold made by someone accustomed to marking the place where they had stopped reading. Margit had never folded the corners of notebooks. She hated doing that to paper. For 4 years, she had taught her students never to do that to books. She stared at the crease for a long time, then looked at the page. Page 11 was where she had written down the supplier debts, the last 3 lines written in a different colored pen because she had run out of ink halfway through. The total at the bottom of the page was 42,210. She closed the notebook, put it back in the drawer, and stood there for a while with one hand resting on the counter. Across town, on the 2nd floor of the Union Building 3 blocks from the harbor, Francis Delmar was waiting with a stack of papers in his hand. He watched August take off his coat and hang it on the hook. "Where have you been?" he asked, in the voice of a man who had asked that question many times and had never once received an answer. August didn't answer this time either. He sat down and pulled the stack of papers toward himself. During the next 2 hours, he did 3 things. He called someone in Fall River and spoke for exactly 40 seconds. He called someone in New Bedford and said nothing for most of the conversation, only listened, then finally answered that he understood. His third call was to the shift supervisor at Pier 2, and he told him to change the unloading order for Thursday, put Almeida's shipment first, and move the other company's shipment to the end. Then he signed his name once at the bottom of the schedule, and pushed it across to Delmar. No one was threatened. No one was warned. Only one order was rearranged, and 4 days later, a trucking company in New Bedford lost a contract they had signed back in June. That was how August Kowalski worked. He didn't need anyone to be afraid of him in the room. He only needed them to understand what had happened after he had been gone for a long time. 412 people made their living by schedules like that, and for 14 months now, every one of those schedules had passed through his hands. Before that, they had passed through his uncle's hands. Then one day last July, they came to put handcuffs on him right in the middle of the warehouse yard, and no one at the union failed to understand that it was his own nephew who had set the whole thing in motion. Half the people here still didn't understand why. They still greeted August in the hallways, still did exactly what he told them to do, but there was a very thin distance in the way they stood when he walked past. Delmar understood why. He was the only one who understood, and he had never said a single word about it to anyone, not even to August. He picked up the schedule, checked the signature again, and left the room. When the door closed, August sat still for a while. Then he opened the desk drawer and took out the leather notebook. It was small, its cover softened by the touch of human hands, and he didn't use it for union business. He opened it, not from the beginning, but somewhere in the middle, to a page he knew exactly where to find. On that page was a name written in capital letters, and beneath it were 4 lines. The ink was older than everything else on the page. August read those 4 lines again, even though he had known them by heart for a long time. He didn't add anything. He didn't change anything. He closed the notebook, put it back in the drawer, and sat alone in that room for a very long time after night had already fallen. At 6 o'clock on Monday morning, the coffee shop 200 meters from Pier 4 was already crowded. Curtis Boyle sat at the table in the back with a newspaper folded into quarters and his second cup of coffee, and he saw August Kowalski walk in before the door had even finished closing. There was one thing everyone at the Port of Providence knew. When August wanted to speak with someone, that person was called up to the 2nd floor of the Union building and made to wait in the hallway. He didn't go looking for people. So when he pulled out a chair and sat down across from Boyle, Boyle put down the newspaper and started talking at once, even though August hadn't asked him anything. August ordered a black coffee. Then he said nothing for 4 minutes. Boyle talked for all 4 of them. He said the contract with that shipping company was only temporary, that he intended to report it to the union later that week, that their price was better, and he had 19 workers whose wages he had to pay, that none of this was meant as an offense against anyone, that he and August's uncle had been doing business together since 2003, and had never once exchanged a harsh word. He stopped there, because mentioning August's uncle was a mistake, and he realized it the moment the words left his mouth. August took a sip of coffee. He set the cup down, took the leather notebook from the inside pocket of his coat, opened it with one hand, and read 3 lines aloud in the voice of a man reading a cargo manifest. 31 containers. Pier 4. Thursday. Then he closed the notebook. Boyle looked at the notebook, then at him. "What are you going to do?" August put the notebook back into his pocket. "Nothing." The man waited for the rest of the sentence. The rest never came. "That's exactly your problem," August said, and he stood up, walked to the counter, paid for both cups of coffee, and headed for the door. He didn't turn back. Boyle's 31 containers arrived at Pier 4 on Thursday morning, exactly as scheduled. They were unloaded into the yard, and no one touched them again. No order was ever given. No one refused to work. Not a single longshoreman knew he was participating in anything, because there was nothing to participate in. It was simply that whenever it was time to handle that shipment, there was always another load that needed unloading first, a crane that was busy, a shift that had just ended. On the first day, Boyle thought it was a problem with the schedule. On the third day, he called the shift supervisor and was told that everything was still on schedule. On the 5th day, the shipping company called him. On the 7th day, his customer in Hartford called. On the 9th day, he sat in his car outside the container yard for 2 hours and watched his 31 steel boxes lying motionless under the sun, not sealed, not detained, violating nothing, simply not being unloaded. On the morning of the 10th day, he went up to the 2nd floor of the Union building and waited in the hallway for 40 minutes. When he was finally admitted, he apologized. August listened to everything, nodded once, and told Francis Delmar to bring out Friday's schedule. Boyle's shipment was unloaded the following day. No one mentioned the matter again, And over the next 2 weeks, 2 more contractors quietly canceled private agreements they had been negotiating, even though no one had spoken a word to them. That afternoon, Delmar stayed behind after everyone else had gone home. He put the papers into his briefcase, then stopped. "And the matter at Federal Hill?" he said. August didn't look up. "Tulloch's men have started having dinner there. 4 of them, same table every night." Delmar let the words hang in the room for a while. "What are you going to do?" August still didn't answer. Delmar waited another beat, then understood there would be no answer, so he closed his briefcase and walked out. When the door was shut, August opened the drawer and took out the leather notebook. He didn't turn from the beginning. He opened it directly to the page, with the name written in capital letters, and this time he read all 4 lines beneath it, 1 word at a time, as though there were some possibility they had changed since the last time he looked at them. They hadn't changed. They had been lying there for 15 years. Margaret Vass came to Federal Hill on a day near the end of May, 4 months before that Tuesday afternoon, and the first thing she did wasn't open the cafe but sit on the front step outside for nearly an hour. The cafe had been closed for 8 months since her grandfather died. 8 months was long enough for the dust on the counter to build into a layer thick enough to write in, and someone had written something on it, probably a kid who had slipped in through the back door. 2 words she couldn't make out. She wiped them away first. Before that, she had taught 4th grade in Cranston for 4 years. She knew the full names of 112 children and knew which ones needed to be called to the board and which ones didn't. She submitted her resignation in April, and the principal had asked her 3 times whether she was sure, and all 3 times Margaret had given exactly the same answer, in exactly 1 word. She sold her apartment in Cranston in 6 weeks, faster than she had expected, and took a loss compared with what she had paid because she didn't have time to wait. All of that money went into 2 places, and neither place was meant for her. On Wednesday afternoon, after closing the cafe, she drove to the hospital. Sandor was sitting in his usual chair by the window with a line running into his left arm, and he was watching a game on the television mounted on the wall that he didn't care about. He was 26 years old. 3 times a week, 4 hours each time, for 14 months. Margaret sat down in the plastic chair beside him and handed him the meal container she had reheated from the cafe. "The soup's a little salty today," she said. "You say that every week." "Because it's a little salty every week." Sandor opened the container and managed to eat a few spoonfuls before setting it down. He looked at his arm for a while, then looked at his sister. "Did you quit teaching because of the cafe, or because of me?" Margaret didn't answer. She picked up the lid and twisted it back on tightly. "I want to know," Sandor said. "If it's because of the cafe, then I think you're a little foolish. If it's because of me, then I think you're much more foolish. Finish eating, Margaret. Finish eating." He finished it. On the way home, she stopped at the grocery store and bought flour and eggs for the next day, then went back, turned on the lights in the cafe, and sat at the table near the window. She turned over the back of a supplier invoice and began calculating again. She calculated the cost of anti-rejection medication if Sandor received a transplant, $3,000 a month, insurance covering the first 36 months, and nothing after that. She calculated the cafe's tax debt. She calculated the average revenue from the previous 4 months, then multiplied it by 12 months ahead, using the most optimistic assumption she could allow herself to have. She did it with the red ballpoint pen she had used for grading papers and still hadn't thrown away. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since October of the previous year, and she wasn't about to start at 9:30 at night in an empty cafe. She simply calculated, and when she finished, she drew a horizontal line beneath the final number and sat there looking at it. The next morning, Rosalind Pike came over. The owner of the flower shop across the street was 61 years old, had stood in that shop for 30 years, and she brought a bouquet of yellow daisies wrapped in brown paper. "For the table by the window," she said. "It looks too empty." Margaret was about to pay, and Rosalind waved her off. Then she didn't leave right away. She stood there with both hands resting on the back of a chair and looked around the cafe once. "I have to tell you something," she said. "This has been sitting in my stomach since your grandfather died." Margaret waited. "That last year, your grandfather came over to my shop 3 times. All 3 times he asked to buy flowers for that table, and all 3 times he asked whether I'd let him put it on credit. Put it on credit, you understand. $40. And all 3 times I said no." She paused. "I didn't say no because of the $40. I said no because I thought he'd get embarrassed and stop asking, and I thought that would make things less awkward for both of us. But the third time, he stood exactly where you're standing now, and he said thank you, then went home, and he never came over again until he died. Margit said nothing. Your grandfather kept this cafe for 47 years, Rosalind said. I don't know how he managed to keep it, and now I think I should have known. She went home. Margit stood there holding the bouquet of daisies for a long time. Her grandfather had asked to buy $40 worth of flowers on credit. She had been back here for 4 months, and not once had she thought about reopening the books from the final 3 years of his life. August came back on Friday afternoon, 6 days after the last time he had sat there, and he offered no explanation for what had happened before. She didn't ask either. She poured him a coffee and set it in front of him. And this time he didn't pay 3 times the price, nor did he immediately hand over the exact amount. He simply rested one hand on the counter and sat there. The yellow daisies had been placed in a porcelain vase on the table beside the window, and 3 customers were sitting at the back, finishing a late meal. Margit washed cups. She didn't ask him how he had known the number in her drawer the week before, and she didn't ask why he had come back. There were questions that, once asked, forced a person to answer, and she had taught long enough to know that the quickest way to make someone say something was not to demand that they say it. August sat for about 20 minutes before he stood and walked toward the wall behind the window table. The entire wall was covered with photographs, black and white photographs, faded yellow photographs, white-bordered Polaroids, wooden frames, each one different from the next, hung without any real order. There were pictures of the cafe when it had first opened, the hand-painted sign still untouched, pictures of a crowd packed onto the sidewalk in the snow, pictures of a woman standing beside the wood stove and smiling at someone outside the frame. August looked at them one by one, slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. Then he stopped. The photograph was in the second row from the bottom, in a dark wooden frame, smaller than most of the others. 2 men were standing in front of the cafe on a sunny day. The man on the right was handing over a ring of keys, while the man on the left was reaching out to take them, and both of them were looking into the camera rather than at each other, the way people stood when someone told them to hold still for a picture. In the lower right corner of the photograph, a faint string of numbers was printed, August 1994. Who's this? August asked. Margit wiped her hands on a towel and walked over. The man on the left is my grandfather. She tilted her head slightly to the right to see more clearly. The other man, I don't know. My grandfather never wrote names on the backs of photographs. I took them all out and checked. The backs are completely blank, every one of them. She gave a small laugh. I used to make my students put their names on everything they turned in. I suppose I got that from my grandfather. August didn't laugh with her. He stood staring at the man on the right. He was half a head taller than the old man, wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and he stood in a very particular way. All his weight shifted onto his left leg, his right shoulder hanging slightly lower, the hand not holding the keys hanging loosely and curled inward just a little. August had watched that posture every day for the first 22 years of his life. He even knew how the man would shift his weight to the other leg after about a minute, if he had to stand for very long. Probably one of my grandfather's business partners, Margit said. The cafe did pretty well back then, too. My grandfather used to say there were weeks in the 90s when they'd sell out of the whole pot by 7 in the evening. She looked over at him. Did you know him? The 3 customers at the back stood up, and one of them dropped a spoon onto the floor. The sound of it hitting the floor was unmistakably clear. August kept looking at the photograph. No, he said. I didn't know him. Margit nodded and turned back inside to ring up the customers. She thought nothing more about his answer. There was no reason for her to. August remained in front of the wall of photographs for a little while longer, then returned to the counter, placed the exact price of the coffee down, and left. That night he went home to the house on Atwell's Avenue, the house he had bought after his mother died and had never changed a thing inside. He didn't turn on the living room lights. He went straight to the study, opened the bottom drawer of the wooden cabinet, and took out a leather notebook. It wasn't the notebook he carried in his coat pocket. This one was larger, its spine cracked, the strap wrapped around it worn so thin it was nearly broken. He placed it on the desk. He pulled out the chair and sat down in front of it. He remained like that for a very long time, both hands resting on the desk on either side of the notebook, never touching it. This notebook had belonged to his father. It had been sitting in that drawer for a very long time, and August had read it from beginning to end exactly once, during the week he received it, and he hadn't opened it again since. He knew what it contained. That was precisely the problem. At last he stood, put the notebook back into the bottom drawer, closed the cabinet, and went out into the living room, where he sat in the dark until almost dawn. Preston Hale came in at 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning, at a time when the cafe had only 2 old men sitting at the table in the back drinking coffee, and he took the third chair from the end of the counter rather than the last one. He was 36 years old, carrying a thin leather briefcase, and the first thing he did was order a bowl of soup. He finished the entire bowl before saying anything about business. "This is really good," he said. "I'm not saying that to be polite. I've eaten at 11 places in this neighborhood over the past 6 weeks because of work, and this is the only thing I've finished." Then, he opened the briefcase. Ardent Group had bought 9 of the 12 lots on this block over the past 2 years. Preston gave her that number right at the beginning, without any circling around the subject, and spread a color-coded map of the neighborhood across the counter. 9 squares were shaded, 3 were still white, and one of those 3 was Vass's. "The other 2 will sign this month," he said. "I'm not telling you that to put pressure on you. I'm telling you because you'll know in 2 weeks anyway, and I'd rather be the one to tell you first." Margaret wiped her hands and stood there listening. "What about my place?" Preston turned to the next sheet. "Your place is the difficult one." He turned the paper toward her. It was a copy of a city historic preservation registration dated November 1998, and beneath it was Stefan Vass's signature. "Your grandfather registered this building as a city historic property 28 years ago," Preston said. "That means no one can tear it down, alter the facade, or fold it into a larger development project without the voluntary signature of the person whose name is on the title. No court can force it. No council can vote it through. The only thing that can do it is your signature." Margaret looked at the document. She had never seen it before. "Can I keep this copy?" "It's already a copy. Keep it." He left the paper there and turned to the next page. "Now I'll tell you my side. Ardent will pay you $42,000 to settle the cafe's supplier debt and tax debt, paid directly to the creditors rather than through you, so you won't have to pay taxes on that amount. On top of that, $210,000 for the rights to the land and building. And one more clause that I added myself, not something the company asked for. You keep the entire name, the recipes, and the sign, and if you ever want to reopen somewhere else in the city, Ardent will cover the first 18 months of rent at the new location." He closed the briefcase. "I know your younger brother is on dialysis. I know because that's part of my job, and I'm sorry I have to mention it. I won't say anything more about it." Margaret listened to everything. She didn't interrupt him once. When he finished, she stood still for a moment, picked up the paper bearing her grandfather's signature, folded it in half, and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. "I'm not selling," she said. Preston nodded as though he had expected that answer. "You have 30 days to think about it. I just answered you." "I know." He took out his wallet and placed the money for the bowl of soup on the counter. "The exact price plus a tip, but 30 days is still 30 days, and I still have to say that, because it's my job." He stood and put on his coat. Then he stopped at the door and turned back to look at her, and he smiled. It wasn't the polite smile of a man who had just been refused. It was a genuine smile, warm, almost kind, the kind of smile worn by someone who had just heard something that pleased him. "Your grandfather registered this building in 98, he said. "Have you ever wondered what happened in 98? Then he walked out the door. Margaret stood behind the counter with the folded paper in the pocket of her apron. If he had frowned, if he had threatened her, if he had left a business card and told her she'd change her mind, she would have known what to think. But he smiled, and he truly smiled, and throughout the entire afternoon she kept returning to the thought that a person only smiled like that when they knew for certain that they didn't have to hurry. At 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon, the bell above the cafe door rang, and Margaret looked up to see 3 children crowding their way inside, with 2 mothers behind them. She recognized them immediately, before they even had a chance to call her name. The tallest was Colby, who had sat at the second desk in the window row the year before, and always asked to go outside for water at exactly math time. The girl beside him was Nadia, who had read the library's book about birds 3 times from cover to cover. The youngest was Tobin, the only child in the entire class who had called her by her name instead of her title, and he still called her that now, very loudly, from the doorway. One of the mothers laughed apologetically. The kids heard you opened a cafe here and have been begging to come for 2 weeks. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and came out from behind the counter. She crouched down so she was at Tobin's eye level and asked which desk he sat at this year, and Tobin answered that he sat in the front row, having been moved because he talked too much, and he said it with pride rather than embarrassment. All 3 children made their way to the corner table, the only table in the cafe with a long bench against the wall and squeezed together on one side. Margaret brought out 3 tray liners and a box of crayons she had kept in the drawer beneath the cash register since the first day she reopened, even though until today she hadn't had any reason to take them out. Then she went into the kitchen and made waffles. She made 7, 3 for the children, 2 for the mothers, and 2 more because she knew Tobin would finish his in 4 minutes, and then sit there watching Nadia eat. For the next half hour, the cafe was noisier than it had been during all the afternoons combined since May. Colby drew a dinosaur, then drew a second, smaller dinosaur beside it, and said that one was its baby brother. Nadia drew birds, of course, a very detailed bird with every feather on its wings carefully drawn. And she explained to the 2 mothers that this particular species didn't migrate. Tobin turned his tray liner upside down because there was writing printed on the other side, and he said the words made it confusing. At one point, powdered sugar fell onto the floor, and Colby bent down to pick it up, and Margaret told him to leave it there, and the whole table laughed because their former teacher had just told a child not to clean something up. The 2 mothers drank coffee and told her stories about this year's class, about the new teacher, about how the morning reading program had changed its schedule. Margaret listened and asked exactly the questions that only someone who genuinely wanted to know would ask. Around 4 o'clock, Tobin slid down from the bench and walked over to her holding his tray liner with both hands. For you. He had drawn the cafe, a brown rectangle, a door in the middle, 2 square windows, and on the roof was something that was probably a chimney, because 3 curling rings of smoke rose from it. Inside one of the windows was a stick figure with black hair tied back behind her head. Above the building, written in blue crayon with letters of uneven size, were 4 words: Vass's Cafe. The 2 S's in Vass overlapped because he had run out of room. Margaret took the drawing. She looked at it for longer than she needed to. Then she said thank you, in an ordinary voice, because she didn't want to make the boy feel awkward. She went behind the counter, took tape from the drawer, and hung the picture on the wall behind it, directly above the place where the cups were kept, where it could be seen from anywhere in the cafe. It stays there forever, okay? She said. Tobin nodded as though that were the most obvious thing in the world. At 4:30, the 2 mothers told the children it was time to get up. It was still light outside, the sunlight still golden across the sidewalk on the other side of the street, and the children headed out the door, arguing about whether Nadia's bird could fly faster than Colby's dinosaur. Nadia said no, because dinosaurs couldn't fly. Colby said his could. The door closed, and their argument grew fainter, then disappeared around the corner. Margaret stood behind the counter in the cafe that had just become quiet again. She looked at the drawing taped to the wall, the brown building with 3 curling rings of smoke and the stick figure in the window. For 4 months, she had stood in this place every day, and every day the cafe had been a number that needed to be solved. This afternoon, it wasn't a number. She stood there, and for the first time since May, she felt something inside her chest grow lighter, as though someone had just lifted away something she had forgotten she was carrying. The woman came in the following Monday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and she sat in the 4th chair from the end of the counter. She was in her early 40s, with short hair, and she didn't carry a briefcase, a purse, or anything at all, except a phone, which she placed face down on the counter the moment she sat. She ordered a black coffee. She drank half the cup before speaking. "My name is Mira Odegaard," she said. "I work for the United States Attorney's Office for this district. I'm here in an official capacity, and I'll tell you that right from the beginning, because I don't like the way people sit and eat for half an hour before finally saying who they are." Margaret was wiping down the espresso machine. She put the cloth down. There was one customer sitting at the table in the back, reading a newspaper, and Odegaard glanced toward him once before lowering her voice just enough. "You're not a subject of an investigation," she said. "I'm telling you that first because if I leave it until the end, you won't hear anything I say for the next 20 minutes. Then what am I? You're a woman with a cafe I'm interested in." Margaret tilted her head slightly to the right. "How many times has he been here?" Odegaard asked. Margaret didn't answer. "Let me ask that another way. She set down her coffee. August 12th, August 19th, August 26th, September 2nd, September 9th, September 16th, September 23rd. Do you want me to keep going? She didn't take out a piece of paper. She didn't open her phone. She recited those dates as though they were lines from a poem she had memorized long ago, keeping her eyes on Margaret the entire time, and that was what made a chill run down Margaret's spine. If the woman had spread a stack of photographs across the counter, it would have felt like an investigation. But she knew the dates by heart, and people only memorized things they had read over and over again. What does he order? Odegaard asked. He orders soup. Has he said anything to you? Nothing worth writing down. I'll decide that. Margaret picked up the cloth and wiped the same spot again. What do you want from me? Odegaard slowly turned her coffee cup once on the countertop. I want to ask you one question, and I already know you're going to answer no, and I still have to ask. She paused for a beat. Do you know that from 2011 through 2015, your grandfather was the named holder of an account at a bank on Broadway, and that over those 4 years, more than $1,800,000 passed through that account? Margaret stopped moving. What? I'll say it more slowly. You don't have to. She set the cloth down. You have the wrong person. My grandfather sold soup. He never had $10,000 in a bank account in his entire life. I know, Odegaard said. That's exactly what caught my attention. She let the words settle between them. Money came in. Money went out. Within 3 to 9 days. Steadily. For 4 years. Not $1 stayed there. Do you understand what I'm saying? No. Yes, you do. You just don't want to understand yet. The customer at the back folded his newspaper and left. The bell above the door rang. That money belonged to the Kowalski organization, Odegaard said. The man running it at the time was the uncle of the man who still sits in that chair at the end of the counter. He's serving a sentence. His nephew isn't. Margaret stood motionless behind the counter. I'm not saying your grandfather was a criminal, Odegaard said, and for the first time, there was something in her voice that came close to gentleness. I've been doing this for 19 years. In those 19 years, I've seen every kind of person put their name on an account. Some do it because they're greedy. Some do it because they've been pushed into a place where there's nowhere left to go. I haven't decided which kind your grandfather was, and I have no intention of deciding too quickly. She took out her wallet and placed money on the counter. But there's something you should know. This cafe has a file. Your grandfather's name is in that file, and the man who still comes here every week knows what's in that file better than I do. She stood. What do you want me to do? Nothing today. Odegaard put on her coat. I just want you to know where you're standing. People make their worst decisions when they think they're standing somewhere else. She reached the door, then stopped. You came back here in May. He started coming here in August. Have you ever wondered why it was August? Then she left. Margaret stood behind the counter for a very long time. The cafe was empty. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the sunlight had shifted to the other side of the street. She thought about her grandfather asking to put $40 worth of flowers on credit during the final year of his life. She thought about $1,800,000 passing through his hands over 4 years. Those two things couldn't both be true, and she knew that they were both true, and she didn't understand how. Then she thought about the man who sat in the chair at the end of the counter, and about the drawer beneath the cash register, and about the small fold in the corner of page 11 that she hadn't made. She walked around from behind the counter, went to the wall of photographs, and stood in front of the picture, taken in August 1994. 2 men, a ring of keys being handed over. She looked at the man on the right, the man he had said he didn't know, and this time she looked for a very long time. Margaret didn't wait until Friday. She closed the cafe at 4 o'clock the following afternoon, hung the wooden sign her grandfather had hung thousands of times, took the photograph down from the wall, and drove 3 blocks to the Union Building on Allen Street. She had passed that building a few hundred times in her life without ever really looking at it. It was a 4-story brick building, with a tarnished brass sign at the entrance, and inside, the first-floor hallway smelled of paper and stale coffee, exactly like the elementary school hallway she had walked through every morning. 3 men were sitting on a long bench against the wall. No one asked where she was going. The person at the reception desk asked whether she had an appointment, and she said no. The person looked at her for 2 seconds, picked up the phone, said one very short sentence, and set it back down. 2nd floor, end of the hall. The three men on the bench watched her all the way up the stairs. The office door at the end of the second-floor hallway was already open. August was sitting behind the desk with a stack of unloading schedules in front of him, and he didn't look surprised, and that bothered her more than anything else could have. She walked in, placed her bag on the desk, took the photograph out of the towel, and set it on the desk facing him. He looked at it. He didn't pick it up. "You said you didn't know him," Margaret said. August didn't answer. He folded the stack of schedules and pushed it aside. "Yesterday, someone from the United States Attorney's Office came to my cafe," she said. "She recited 7 dates, when you had been sitting in my cafe, from memory. She asked me whether I knew my grandfather had once been the named holder of a bank account." She let a beat pass. "I didn't come here to ask you about that account. I came here to ask you about this photograph." He remained silent. "I taught 4th grade for 4 years," Margaret said. 112 children. Do you know what I learned? I learned how to tell the difference between a child who's lying and a child who's choosing to stay silent, because the two look completely different. A child who's lying looks straight into your eyes. A child who chooses silence looks somewhere else and sits very still, because they know that if they open their mouth, they'll have to lie a second time, and they don't want to do that. She looked at him. "You're sitting very still." August reached out and turned the photograph slightly, straightening it. Then he spoke. "The man on the right is my father. His name is Witold Kowalski." Margaret didn't move. "My father and your grandfather knew each other," he said. "Not casually. They knew each other." "How long?" "A long time." "How long, August?" He didn't answer that question. "Why did you hide this from me?" He looked at the photograph. "Because you're keeping a cafe that you think your grandfather left to you. And if I told you everything else, you wouldn't see him the way you do now." Margaret straightened. "That's my decision." "I know." "No, you don't. If you did, you wouldn't have made that decision for me." She placed both hands on the back of the chair in front of her. "People have made decisions for me often enough. My grandfather decided not to tell me. My brother decided not to tell me where it hurt, because he was afraid I'd worry. And now you. I'm 27 years old. I signed papers to sell an apartment, and every night I sit there calculating my brother's medication costs with a grading pen, and you think I can't handle one truth about my grandfather." He still said nothing. "Tell me," she said. He looked out the window. Outside was a yard filled with wooden pallets, and a forklift moving across it. He sat very still. Margaret waited. She waited longer than she had intended to. Then she picked up the photograph, wrapped it back in the towel, put it into her bag, and she was the one who walked out of the office first. In the hallway, Francis Delmar was standing against the wall beside the stairs with both hands in his pockets, and he looked as though he had been there for a while. "Miss Vass," he said. She stopped. "Do you understand who that man is?" Delmar asked. His voice wasn't threatening. It was almost weary. "I'm asking you honestly. I'm not asking to frighten you." "I understand," Margaret said. "Are you afraid?" She thought about that question longer than he expected. "Yes," she said, "but not for the reason you think." Delmar looked at her. He seemed about to say something else, then decided against it. He nodded once and stepped aside so she could walk down the stairs. In the office at the end of the hallway, August remained in the same place after it had grown completely dark outside, and the stack of unloading schedules was still sitting exactly where he had pushed it aside. Raymond Tulloch was 51 years old, and he had never sat on the second floor of the Union building a single day in his life. He ran the lending operation in Pawtucket out of an insurance office that never had any customers, and for 20 years he had worked under August's uncle, and in all those 20 years he had never once asked why. He was the kind of man that organization had been built on, a man who knew how to make something happen on its own, without anyone ever having to give an order. When August's uncle was handcuffed in the middle of the warehouse yard last July, Ray Tulloch was 4 blocks away, and he sat in his car for 40 minutes after the convoy had disappeared. He didn't say anything during those 40 minutes. Then he drove back to Pawtucket and began counting how many people were still willing to listen to him. By the fall, that number was 37. 37 wasn't much compared with 412, and Ray knew that better than anyone. But he wasn't planning to fight August Kowalski. He wasn't planning to do anything at all. He intended to wait, because he believed that a young man who climbed to the top by selling out his own uncle would eventually leave a weak spot exposed. And when that spot appeared, the only thing you had to do was stand close enough and point at it. At the end of September, he found the weak spot. It wasn't money. It wasn't a shipment. It wasn't a name in a file. It was a 12-seat cafe in Federal Hill that the young man had suddenly begun visiting for dinner. Ray didn't send anyone to speak to Margit Vass. He didn't let anyone call her, leave a message, or stand outside the door. He sent 4 men there to eat dinner. They came on the first Tuesday night at 6:45, and they sat at the long table against the wall on the right, the only table in the cafe that looked directly toward the door and also directly toward the chair at the end of the counter. They ordered 4 meals, finished everything, drank coffee, sat there for another 40 minutes or so, then paid and left exactly a 15% tip. They talked among themselves normally. One of them complimented the soup. Wednesday night they came again, also at 6:45, also at the same table, also 4 men, and 3 of the 4 were the men from the night before. Thursday night was the same. Margit noticed nothing during the first 3 nights. By Friday night, she began to pay attention. By Saturday night, she took a tray liner and started writing down the time they came through the door, exactly the way she used to record the attendance times of 112 children. 6:45, 6:45, 6:46, 6:45. She kept counting until the 11th night, when she stopped writing because there was nothing left to record. Same table, same time, same number of men. None of them said a word to her beyond placing their orders and saying thank you. None of them did anything she could repeat to someone else without sounding like a woman imagining things. That was what made her cold. If they had broken something, she could have called someone. But they paid in full, they left tips, and every night they sat at the table facing the door, and she understood that she wasn't the person they were watching. She was simply the place they were sitting so they could watch. On the 11th night, after they left, she stood wiping that table for a very long time, even though it wasn't dirty. On the 2nd floor of the Allen Street building, Francis Delmar placed a sheet of paper on August's desk and didn't sit down. 4 men. 11 nights in a row, he said. I had someone stand outside and count for 3 nights before I told you, because I wanted to be sure. August looked at the paper. None of them are doing anything, Delmar said. That's Tulloch's cleverness. He doesn't need to do anything. He only needs the whole neighborhood to see those 4 faces sitting there every night. And in 2 weeks, no one will want to eat dinner in that cafe anymore, and no one will be able to say exactly why. August said nothing. Delmar remained there for another moment. Are you going there tonight? Yes. The more often you go there, Delmar said, the longer they'll sit. August kept looking at the paper. Delmar waited for an answer and didn't get one, and eventually he left and closed the door behind him. August sat alone in the room, and he didn't go to the cafe that night. He didn't go the following night either, and he never said a word to Margit about the 4 men sitting at the table facing the door. Anthony Pereira died on a Thursday morning, right at home, while tying his shoes to leave for his 6 o'clock shift. He was 59 years old and had worked at Pier 3 for 15 years. Before that, he had washed dishes and worked as a kitchen helper at Vass's for nearly 9 years, until 2011, when he moved out to the docks, and there were still a few people in Federal Hill who remembered him standing at the sink in the back kitchen and singing at 7 in the evening. The funeral was held at the church on Sutton Street on Saturday morning. The church was crowded. Margit arrived 15 minutes early and sat in the 4th row from the back. She came because Anthony Pereira's name was on the 2nd page of the old payroll book her grandfather had left behind, written in the old man's slanted handwriting, and because she thought it was the right thing to do. August arrived late. He came in after the 2nd hymn had already begun, and he didn't go any farther forward. He stood in the back row, against the wall on the left, and remained standing for the entire service, even though more than half the seats in the last row were empty. No one sat down in the open space beside him. 2 men came in after him, and both automatically moved 3 steps to the right before stopping. Margit turned around once and saw him, and he saw her too. Neither nodded, neither did anything, but both understood immediately that the other person wasn't there by accident, and neither knew exactly why the other had come. After the service, everyone went out into the churchyard behind the building. Mrs. Pereira stood on the steps, and people lined up to say something to her. When it was August's turn, she took both his hands in hers. She thanked him for covering the entire funeral expense. Then she thanked him a 2nd time for the car that had brought the grandchildren up from Fall River. Then she thanked him a 3rd time, and this time she didn't say what she was thanking him for. Through all 3 thanks, she looked at his lapel, at his hands, at the steps, and not once did she lift her eyes to meet his. August said that Anthony had been a good man. Then he stepped out of the line. Margaret waited for her turn. When she said she was Mr. Vass's granddaughter, Mrs. Pereira took her hand and held it much longer. "You're that little girl?" she said. "Our family talks about you all the time. He used to tell us how, when you were tiny, you'd sit at the corner table doing your homework." She smiled. "Your grandfather was a good man. That cafe fed our family for 9 years. Then she gently patted the back of Margaret's hand. "We still talk about the year he had trouble. He said that even then, the old man never cut anyone's wages by a single cent." Someone else came up behind her, and Mrs. Pereira turned away. Margaret stood there for another second, then walked down the steps. The year he had trouble. She crossed the churchyard, trying to think what year that had been. Her grandfather had never told her that he had ever been in trouble. In everything he had told her, over the course of 27 years, there had never been a single sentence about any particular year. Across the churchyard, August was walking toward the gate. Francis Delmar walked beside him, and he waited until the two men reached the sidewalk before speaking, very quietly. "Do you know why she wouldn't look at you?" August didn't answer. Delmar didn't ask a second time. They walked toward the car, and throughout the entire distance August didn't say a word, because he knew. He had known for a long time before Delmar ever asked. 3 envelopes arrived at the cafe that week, and all 3 were sent by certified mail. The first envelope came Monday morning. A notice from the city health department announcing an unscheduled follow-up inspection and stating plainly that the establishment had received a complaint from a third party. The second envelope arrived Tuesday morning, requiring her to produce the operating permit for solid fuel-burning equipment in the downtown district, along with a copy of the most recent inspection certificate from within the previous 24 months. The third envelope arrived Wednesday afternoon and was the heaviest of the 3. It was a fire code violation notice concerning the wood stove chimney, stating that the structure had been installed in 1979 and had no record of being upgraded under the standards issued in 2009, and that the establishment had 10 business days to submit a remediation plan. Margaret called the office listed at the top of the letter. The person who answered was very polite. She asked who had filed the complaint, and the person told her that information could not be disclosed. She asked why that chimney had been operating for 47 years and only now had become a problem, and the person said they weren't authorized to answer that question, their voice carrying genuine apology. She thanked them and hung up. She sat at the table by the window with the 3 notices spread out in front of her, and she understood that none of the 3 papers was wrong. That was the difficult part. The chimney really had been built in 79. The permit really had never been renewed, because her grandfather had operated that stove for 47 years under an old regulation that no one had bothered to revisit. No one had invented anything. They had simply started looking. That same week, something else began spreading through the neighborhood without a single envelope being delivered. It started at the shoe repair shop at the end of the block and moved through the sandwich shop, the barber shop, the 2 vegetable stands, and by Thursday, it had traveled through the whole neighborhood. The message was short, and no one's name was attached to it. Vass's was in a dispute. No one said what the dispute was about, who it was with, and that was precisely why no one could refute it. In Federal Hill, people didn't need the details. They only needed to hear the words in a dispute, and that was enough to choose somewhere else for dinner on Saturday night. Saturday was the busiest night of the week. Margaret woke at 5 in the morning, simmered the stock for 7 hours, and by 5 in the afternoon she had 30 servings ready, exactly as she had every Saturday since June. She added 2 extra chairs at the end of the counter as usual. She turned on the light above the sign at 5:30. At 6, no one came. At 6:30, no one came. 6:45 passed, and the 4 men from the previous week didn't come either, and standing behind the counter, she realized that even they had stopped coming, and somehow that was worse. At 7:30, an elderly couple stopped in front of the window, looked inside, the wife said something, and the 2 of them continued walking. 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, she didn't turn off the lights. She wiped the entire counter again, straightened the stack of menus, checked every spoon in the tray, and when there was nothing left to do, she sat down in the 3rd chair from the end of the counter and stayed there. The soup pot remained warm on the stove, and every 15 minutes she stood up and stirred it once, because if she didn't, the bottom would scorch, and she stirred it 8 times in all over the course of 3 hours. Across the street, About 20 meters from the cafe door, a car had been parked along the curb since before 8. Its lights were off. Its engine was off. August was sitting inside. He had driven there intending to walk in, and he had been sitting in the car for 30 seconds when he understood that if he went inside, tomorrow night would look exactly like tonight, and the night after that would be the same, and so on until she lost the cafe. The rumor spreading through the neighborhood wasn't really about the chimney. It was about him. He was what was being disputed. He sat there watching through the glass as a woman walked back and forth inside an empty cafe with 30 untouched meals, and he didn't open the car door. At 11 o'clock, some of the lights inside the cafe went out. The door opened. Margaret stepped outside with the ring of keys in her hand. She locked the door, tested the handle twice out of habit, then straightened, and she turned her head and looked directly across the street, at the darkened car parked 20 meters away. She looked long enough that no one could have called it accidental. Then she opened the cafe door, went back inside, and the door closed behind her. August didn't step out of the car. He remained there for another 40 minutes. During those 40 minutes, she packed all 30 servings into 11 large plastic containers, loaded them onto a cart, and pushed them 3 blocks to the side entrance of the church on Sutton Street, where the community kitchen opened at 6 o'clock Sunday morning. She walked home alone. By the time she got back, the car across the street was gone. 3 days later, on Tuesday afternoon, August called the cafe on the landline, and Margaret was the one who answered. He said he needed to use the cafe that night after closing, around 9:30, for no more than 40 minutes, and he would pay her. She asked what for. He didn't answer that question. She stayed silent long enough for him to know she was considering it. Then she said yes, and hung up before he could. At 9:30 that night, she had hung the sign and turned off all the lights in the front, leaving only the 2 bulbs above the counter on. She was in the kitchen. The kitchen door cracked open as always, because the hinge hadn't closed properly in a long time. August knew she was there. He saw her shadow pass across the narrow opening when he walked in, and he had known even before that, because 9:30 on Tuesday nights was when she washed the pots, and she had done it every Tuesday since June, and he had spent enough time in that cafe to know. He could have met Ray Tulloch on the 2nd floor of the Allen Street building. He could have met him anywhere in this city. He chose this place, chose that exact hour, because there was something he needed Margaret Vass to understand, and he didn't have the courage to sit across from her and say it. Ray arrived at 9:35 with another man, and the other man remained outside the door. August was already sitting in the chair at the end of the counter, where he always sat, his back to the door. He pointed to the chair on his left, the one pushed against the wall, the place where whoever sat would see neither the entrance nor anyone passing along the sidewalk. Ray looked at the chair for a second, then sat down. In Federal Hill, people understood things like that without anyone having to explain them. "It's been a long time," Ray said. "Your uncle still asks about you." August placed the leather notebook on the counter. He didn't open it. He simply left it there between them, the cover facing upward. Ray looked at the notebook. Then he looked away, and it was the first time during the meeting that he had looked somewhere else. 4 men, 11 nights, August said. The long table against the wall on the right, 6:45. "People go out to dinner. You take your 37 people off this street." Ray laughed. It was the laugh of a man who was 51 years old and had been sitting in rooms like this since August was too young to read. "Or what?" August's voice didn't change. "There is no or." He looked directly at him. "I'm not saying it twice." In the kitchen, the sound of running water stopped. Ray Tulloch sat still for about 5 seconds. He had prepared for a negotiation, for a threat, for some number to be placed in front of him, and he knew how to deal with all of those things. He hadn't prepared for there to be nothing at all. He looked at the closed notebook on the counter one more time, and he didn't know what was inside it, and that was the whole problem. He stood up. "Your father used to leave that notebook on the table too," he said. "I know," August replied. Ray walked out. The door closed, and the footsteps of the 2 men grew more distant along the sidewalk. During the next 2 weeks, the 4 men never came back to Vass's, and by the end of the 2nd week, 6 of Ray Tulloch's men found a way to send word up to the 2nd floor on Allen Street that they wanted back into the Union. None of those 6 men were afraid. They had lived their entire lives inside that organization, and they weren't afraid of anyone. They simply sat down and calculated, the way people calculated a shipment, and they came to the conclusion that in 5 years, the name still standing at the port of Providence wouldn't be Tulloch. That night, after the door had been locked, the kitchen door opened, and Margaret stepped out with the dish towel draped over her shoulder. She walked behind the counter and stood facing him. She didn't wipe her hands. She didn't pick anything up. "You just used my grandfather's cafe to do that," she said. "Yes. You knew I was in the kitchen." "I knew. Were you ever going to ask me first?" August looked at the notebook lying on the counter between them. "No," he said. Margaret nodded slowly, as though she had just received exactly the answer she had been waiting for, and it didn't make her feel any better at all. "Do you know what the worst part is?" she said. "The worst part isn't that you did it. The worst part is that you did it so I would hear it. You sat 4 meters away from me and told someone else the thing you couldn't tell me." He didn't object. He didn't explain. He took out his wallet and placed the money on the counter, exactly the amount he had said over the phone, then picked up the notebook and slipped it into his inner coat pocket. At the door, he paused for a beat. "Starting tomorrow, they'll come back and eat here," he said. "The people from the neighborhood, that's what I mean." Then he walked out. Margaret stood alone in the cafe with the 2 lights above the counter still burning, and she realized he was right, and she also realized that she had never hated a truth so much. The call from the hospital came Thursday afternoon, while the cafe had 7 customers inside, and Margaret had to step out onto the sidewalk before she could hear clearly. The transplant coordinator said they had found a suitable living donor for Sandor. She asked twice to make sure she had heard correctly. The person on the other end said the tissue matching was complete. The donor had passed the entire medical and psychological screening process, and the hospital was scheduling the procedure for the following month. Margaret asked who the donor was. The coordinator said the donor had chosen to remain anonymous, and the hospital wasn't permitted to provide any identifying information. Margaret stood on the sidewalk with the phone in her hand, and for about 30 seconds she felt weightless, as though someone had just cut a cord that had been pulling her downward for 14 months. Then the cord tightened again. Anonymous. Living. Right now. She drove straight to Allen Street, and this time she didn't stop at the reception desk. She went up to the 2nd floor and pushed open the door at the end of the hallway, and 2 men were sitting in front of August's desk, and she stood in the doorway until both of them got up and walked out. "What did you do?" she asked before the door had even closed behind them. August set down his pen. "My brother has a donor. Anonymous. Living." She stepped closer to the desk. "What did you do?" "I don't understand what you're asking." "You understand perfectly." Her voice wasn't loud. That was the strangest part. She had stood in front of 112 children for 4 years, and she knew that raising your voice was the quickest way to lose hold of whatever you were trying to keep. People don't just donate a kidney to a stranger. Not while 4 of Tulloch's men were sitting in my cafe eating dinner for 11 nights in a row. Not during the same week I received those 3 envelopes. I don't know how much money you have, but I know you have money. And I need you to tell me right now that you didn't go buy an organ from someone and put it inside my brother." August stood. He walked 3 steps to the window and then turned back, and when he spoke, his voice was lower than before. Slower, and the room suddenly felt cold. "You think I did those things?" He looked at her. "Fine. You have the right to think that, and I'm not going to try to convince you you're wrong." He let a beat pass. "But you need to understand something. If I had really done that, you would never have known. There would have been no call from the hospital. There would have been no word anonymous. You would only have heard that your brother was lucky, and you would have believed it, and you would have spent the next 20 years thanking God." He sat down again. "People don't ask me questions like that, Miss Vass. Not because they trust me, because they've already answered them for themselves." Margaret stood there. She meant to say something and couldn't. She walked out. 2 days later, in the 4th floor waiting room at the hospital, she met the physician overseeing Sandor's case, and she asked, not to force a name out of him, but to ask the one thing she needed to know. He told her the donor was 52 years old, had completed the full evaluation of kidney function and cardiovascular health, and had also undergone the independent interview with a social worker that the hospital required of every living donor. He added that the donor had come forward on his own, had asked very careful questions, and had signed the paperwork during the 2nd meeting. Margaret asked him one final question. He told her he couldn't give her the name, but he said the man had mentioned that he had once worked at the docks. She sat in her car outside the parking lot for 20 minutes. Then she drove to Allen Street for the 2nd time that week, but she didn't go up to the 2nd floor. She stood waiting on the sidewalk, and at 6 o'clock in the evening, Francis Delmar came out. He saw her and didn't look surprised. "You," she said. Delmar stopped. "The doctor said the donor is 52 and used to work at the docks." He didn't deny it. He put both hands into the pockets of his coat and looked down at the sidewalk. "Why?" Margaret asked. "You don't know my brother. You don't know me." "Why?" Delmar didn't answer right away. He looked across the street for a long time, then spoke in the voice of a man who had rehearsed these words in his head many times but had never actually said them aloud. "In 2011, I was the man who brought the envelope to your grandfather's cafe." Margaret didn't understand at first. "What?" "Once a month. I'd walk in through the back door, put it on the table in the kitchen, and walk back out. I did that for 4 years. He still didn't look at her. He never took it. He never opened it. 4 years, Margaret. Not a single one. He left it sitting there until I came back the following month and took it away. Someone walked past them on the sidewalk. Delmar waited until they were gone. He never said a word to me during those 4 years. Only once. The last time. He asked me if I had children. He swallowed. I told him I had 2. He nodded and told me to go home." Margaret stood frozen on the sidewalk. "My grandfather knew," she said. "He knew. Then why didn't he report it?" Delmar looked at her for the first time. "You're asking that question because you don't yet understand what 2011 was like in this neighborhood." He pulled his collar higher. "But there was one person who ended it. It wasn't me. I was only the man who carried the envelopes." He stepped off the curb. "You should ask him. Don't ask me." Preston Hale came in Monday morning, on the 28th day of the 30 days he had given her, and this time he didn't order soup. He sat in the third chair from the end of the counter and placed his briefcase beside the chair without opening it. "I'm not here to ask the same question again," he said. "I'm here because of 2 things, and neither one is part of what the company pays me to do." Margaret poured him coffee. "First, the other 2 lots signed last week. You're the last one, and now Ardent has no way to move forward without you. I'm telling you that because in 2 days someone else from the company will call you, and that person won't be as pleasant as I am." He took a sip. "The second thing is harder to say." He set down the cup. "I looked into the historic registration from 98. I looked because I was curious, not because of work. Do you know what a registration like that requires? An assessment fee, existing condition drawings, an architect's signature, and 4 months. In 98, the total was around $3,400. For a 12-seat cafe, that was serious money." He looked at her. "Your grandfather spent $3,400 and 4 months to do one thing, to turn this building into something no one could force him to sell. Not the city, not the landlord. No one." He let a beat pass, including the people who had loaned him money. Margaret stood still behind the counter. "People don't spend $3,400 fighting something that hasn't happened yet," Preston said. "They spend $3,400 when they've already seen it coming." He took out his wallet and placed the exact price of the coffee on the counter. "I'm telling you this as a person, not as anyone's lawyer. If I were you, I'd find out what happened around here in 98. Then he picked up his briefcase and walked out. And this time he didn't smile. That afternoon, at 3 o'clock, Mira Odegaard pushed open the door. She didn't order coffee. She sat in the 4th chair as she had the last time and waited until the last 2 customers left. "I've come to make you an offer," she said. "I'm going to tell you everything before you interrupt me, and after that, you can take as much time as you need." Margaret wiped her hands and straightened. "Our office already has enough to prosecute the Kowalski organization for organized money laundering. What we don't have is a witness who can stand before a jury and explain how that Broadway account operated. We have documents. Documents make jurors fall asleep. We need a person." She placed both hands on the counter. "You are the legal heir of Stefan Vass. You have the right to access all of his records, books, and correspondence from those 4 years, and you have the right to provide them to us voluntarily. If you cooperate, I can guarantee 3 things." She raised one finger. 1. Any charges that could arise involving Stefan Vass's name will be completely cleared, in writing, signed by the United States Attorney's Office. Your grandfather's name will be clean, and it will be clean on paper, not just clean because I say so. She raised a second finger. 2. You and your brother will be placed under federal witness protection for the duration of the proceedings and for 18 months afterward, your brother included, even while he's in the hospital. She raised a third finger. 3. This cafe will be left alone. The 3 envelopes you received last week will be withdrawn. I don't have authority over the city health department, but I have the phone number of the person who does, and that person owes me." She lowered her hand. Margit stood there for a very long time. "What about Kowalski?" Odegaard didn't blink. "August Kowalski faces 15 years in prison." The cafe fell silent. Somewhere outside, a car horn sounded in the distance. "I'm not going to lie to you," Odegaard said. "I could sit here and tell you that none of this concerns you, that you're simply providing the truth, and the court will decide what happens. But I've been doing this for 19 years, and I don't speak that way to decent people." She looked directly at Margit. "This case doesn't stand without you. Whether it stands or collapses is up to you. You sign, and he goes away for 15 years. You don't sign, and in 2 years our office closes the file because the statute of limitations runs out, and everything about that account, including your grandfather's name in it, will sit in a warehouse forever." She stood and put on her coat. "I'll give you 10 days. Then she stopped at the door. "There's one thing I think you should know before you decide. That account was closed in April of 2015. It wasn't closed because it was discovered. Someone shut it down from the inside." She opened the door. "We never found out who." The door closed. Margit stood alone behind the counter, both hands resting on the wooden surface her grandfather had built in 1979. And for the first time in her life she understood that the fate of a man whom an entire city had learned to look down at the ground when passing him was now sitting, completely, in the hands of a 4th-grade teacher. August knew Odegaard had come to the cafe before the sun went down that evening. Not because anyone was watching Margit, because there was a man inside the United States Attorney's Office for the district who had been taking money from the organization since 2008, and he was still taking it. And August had kept that name in his notebook for 14 months, without using it once. He used it that Monday night. He listened for 4 minutes and didn't ask a single question. Then he sat in his study at home until 2 in the morning and did what he always did whenever he had to make a decision. He calculated. He didn't calculate what he would lose. He calculated what would happen to Margit Vass on the day she signed. This was what he came up with. If she stood before a jury while he was still sitting on the 2nd floor of Allen Street, then in the eyes of the 412 people at the port and Ray Tulloch's 37 men, she wouldn't be a teacher telling the truth about her grandfather. She would be the woman who had brought down August Kowalski. They wouldn't look at the file. They would look at the 12-seat cafe in Federal Hill, and they would remember its name for a very long time. No one would do anything to her. That wasn't how things worked here. No one had to do anything. They only had to remember. And the cafe would slowly die over 10 years, and she would grow old in a neighborhood that had turned its back on her without her ever understanding why. But if he wasn't sitting in that chair anymore, then there was no one left to bring down. There would only be a man who had stepped down on his own, and all the hatred would follow him rather than her. He wasn't stepping down to escape prosecution. He had asked his lawyer about it the month before, and the answer had been clear. Resigning wouldn't erase a single line from the past. If Margit signed, he would still go to court, still face exactly the same file, and whether he was sitting in that chair or not wouldn't change a thing in front of a federal judge. What it changed was somewhere else, in the place no court could govern. Wednesday morning, he called a meeting. 3rd floor, Allen Street, the large room, 19 people, all the shift supervisors and everyone who still had a voice in the union. He didn't speak for long. He stood at the head of the room and said that effective immediately, Francis Delmar would take over everything, that every signature would go through him, and that August was keeping nothing for himself. One man started to ask why. August looked at him, and the man stopped. He had chosen that moment deliberately, choosing it when 6 of Tulloch's men had just asked to return and the entire port knew that the Kowalski name was stronger than ever, because when a man leaves his chair while he's weak, people say he was pushed, but when he leaves while he's strong, no one dares say a word. No one said a word. The meeting lasted 9 minutes. Delmar stayed behind after everyone else had gone, standing for a long time in front of the desk. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I do. You're still going to court." "I know." Delmar looked at him. "Then why are you doing this?" August picked up the leather notebook and slipped it into his inner coat pocket. "Because I don't want people to remember the name of that cafe," he said. The following Tuesday morning, Margit drove to Allen Street. She had carried Odegaard's paper in the pocket of her coat for 6 days, and she still hadn't signed it. She came to ask him one question. Exactly one question. The question Francis Delmar had told her to ask him instead of asking Delmar. She turned into the parking lot and saw the trunk of a car open. August was loading several boxes of files into the back. His coat was draped over the driver's seat. The building door was open, and no one was standing on the steps watching, and that was the detail that made her understand before he even turned around. "Where are you going?" He closed the trunk. "I handed the union over to Delmar last week." Margaret stood still in the middle of the parking lot. "Miss Odegaard came to see me Monday," she said. "I know. How long have you known?" "Since that night." She looked at the boxes in the trunk. She looked at the coat draped over the driver's seat. Then she understood everything all at once, and something tightened inside her chest. "You did this so I'd sign," she said. "No. You did this so that if I signed, I wouldn't be the one who brought you down." August didn't answer. "You made the decision for me again," she said. "You rearranged your whole life, the chair you sat in, your name, everything, so I wouldn't have to choose. You cleared every obstacle out of the way, then put the paper in my hand and told me it was up to me." She took one step closer. "Do you know what that's called? It isn't kindness. It's you taking the last decision I had left." August looked down at the ring of keys in his hand. "That's what I'm best at," he said. "No," Margaret said. "That's what you're best at running away from." August didn't react to that. He opened the car door, took his coat from the driver's seat, and put it on. And Margaret understood that if she let him get behind the wheel, everything would end here, in a parking lot, on a Tuesday morning. "Stop," she said. His hand paused on the car door. "I'm going to say 3 things," Margaret said. "Then, if you want to leave, leave." She stood 4 steps away from him and didn't move any closer. "First, 7 times you sat in that chair at the end of the counter. I stood 3 feet away from you and watched you eat 7 bowls of soup. Not once did you look at the soup. You looked at the wall of photographs. You looked at the kitchen door. You looked out at the sidewalk. People don't eat like that, August. People eat like that when they come somewhere to watch, not to eat." He said nothing. "Second, the night no one walked into my cafe, you sat in the car across the street starting at 8 o'clock. I knew you were there. You knew I knew. And you let me stir a pot containing 30 servings 8 times over 3 hours, and then push it 3 blocks at 11 at night, alone." Her voice still wasn't loud. "You weren't wrong to sit there. I've thought about that over and over, and I know you weren't wrong, but you chose what was right for me, again, without asking me a single word." She paused. "Third, you just stood in front of 19 people and gave away what it took you 14 months to hold on to, just so that today I wouldn't have to say the sentence I came here intending to say to you this morning." She looked directly at him. "I'm not going to testify against you, August. I decided that Thursday night, before I knew what you had done the week before, and you just took even that away from me." The parking lot was very quiet. The sound of cranes drifted from the port, distant and steady. "Now tell me everything," she said. "Not half, not the part you think I can handle. Tell me all of it, and then I'll choose for myself." August stood looking at her for a long time. Then he opened the trunk, pulled out a box, and took from it a leather notebook larger than the one he carried in his pocket. Its spine cracked, the strap around it worn almost through. He placed it on the trunk lid. "This belonged to my father," he said. "I read it exactly once, 12 years ago." He untied the strap. "In '94, my father was 31 years old and had nothing. Your grandfather lent him $4,200 and let him use the back room of the cafe as storage for the first 2 years. No paperwork, no interest. The photograph on your cafe wall was taken the day the old man handed my father the keys to that back room." He turned a page. "For the next 20 years, the two of them kept writing to each other. The dates are here. It wasn't business. They simply wrote to each other." He turned another page. "In 2011, my uncle needed a clean name for the money to pass through. He chose the cafe because the cafe had 40 years of genuine records, and nobody thought to scrutinize a place that sold soup. Your grandfather refused. It's written here." He pointed to a line. "My father objected. He spoke to my uncle 3 times in 2 months. After the 3rd time, he was no longer allowed to sit in any meetings. They didn't throw him out. They simply stopped inviting him." Margaret didn't move. "What else?" she said. August looked down at the notebook. 2014, he said. "You were 15. Something inside Margaret's chest dropped. My uncle ordered it. August said. It was a message to your grandfather, because by then the old man had begun trying to get out of that account. He didn't look at her when he said the next sentence. My father knew. He stepped in and ended it, and 4 months later, he was gone. I was in Chicago. I got the news by phone. Margaret raised one hand to her mouth and left it there. She made no sound. Her father. She was 27 years old, and for 12 years she had believed in one word: accident. And that word had just been taken away from her in 3 sentences, in a parking lot, by the man who had sat in her cafe and eaten soup 7 times. How long have you known? She asked. 12 years. She closed her eyes. Then why has your uncle only been in prison for 14 months? August closed the notebook. This was the place where he could have stopped, and he didn't. You want to know what I did to put him in prison? He said. I didn't report him right away. I let him keep going for another 7 months. 7 months. And I recorded every line, every shipment, every name, until the file was heavy enough. He said it in exactly the same voice he used when reading unloading schedules, because if I acted too early, he would have served only 3 years. Margaret opened her eyes and looked at him. For one very brief moment, she saw him the way people in Federal Hill had always seen him, and she understood why Mrs. Pereira had been afraid to lift her eyes to his. There's one more thing, August said, and this is the worst one, which is why I left it for last. He placed his hand on the trunk lid. I didn't happen to come to that cafe in August. I've known your family for 15 years. I know where your brother receives dialysis. I know what grade you taught in Cranston. I know the day you submitted your resignation. He looked at her. That first bowl of soup, Miss Vass. It wasn't an accident. Nothing in the past 6 weeks was an accident. Margaret said nothing for a very long time. She stood in the middle of the parking lot with her hands hanging at her sides, and she let everything she had just heard settle into its proper place, piece by piece, without rushing. From the direction of the port, the cranes continued their steady rhythm. You've been watching me for 15 years, she finally said, and not once did you give me the chance to look back at you. That's right. You knew where my brother received dialysis. You knew the day I submitted my resignation. You knew how my father died when I didn't. And through all those years, you never once thought about knocking on my door and saying a single thing to me. No. Why? August looked down at the notebook on the trunk lid. Because I carry the Kowalski name. Margaret looked at him for a very long time after that. I taught children for 4 years, she said. 112 of them. Some came to class every day and sat in the back of the room and never raised their hands, not because they didn't know the answer, but because they had decided long ago that they weren't the kind of child anyone called on. I spent an entire year with each one like that, and I know that look, August. I saw it before they even sat down. She took 1 step closer. You have exactly that look, and you're 34 years old. He had nothing to say. I'm not asking you to make things right, she said. You've spent 15 years doing what you thought was right, and look where it brought you. I'm asking you to be real. She looked at the open trunk, the boxes of files, the coat. Start by closing the trunk. August stood still for a moment. Then he picked up his father's leather notebook, placed it on the hood of the car, and closed the trunk. Margaret signed the following week. She told the entire truth, every word, without adding a single thing and without hiding a single thing, and her testimony accomplished 2 things no one at the prosecutor's office had anticipated. It cleared Stefan Voss's name, in writing, exactly as Odegaard had promised. And it proved that the Broadway account had been closed from the inside in April of 2015 by the very person the office had been preparing to prosecute. August wasn't acquitted, and he didn't ask for that. He accepted a plea agreement, 2 years of probation, a fine that took away nearly everything he had, and a permanent ban from participating in any union or transportation-related activity anywhere in the state. He lost everything, and he signed that paper without reading it a second time. Preston Hale lasted 11 days. He cross-checked the 3 names in the notebook against the board of directors at his own company and discovered that all 3 were his direct superiors. And that same morning he filed to withdraw the entire project from the block and submitted his resignation as well. Sandor received his transplant at the end of November, and the surgery went well. Francis Delmar recovered faster than expected, and 3 weeks later, he was able to walk from his home to the port. Raymond Tulloch no longer had anyone left to gather around him, because when August stepped down on his own, the thing Tulloch had spent 14 months waiting for no longer existed to be overturned. On a Saturday morning in early December, Vass's opened at 9 o'clock for a free cooking class. There were 7 children and 5 parents, and Margaret stood at the end of the counter teaching them how to knead dough, and for 2 hours the cafe was noisier than it had been on any morning in its 47-year history. Tobin made a waffle that was badly crooked and declared that he had done it on purpose. Nadia made the shape of a bird, and no one recognized it as a bird until she explained it. In the kitchen at the back, August stood washing trays, and he listened to the laughter drifting through the crack in the kitchen door for those entire 2 hours without stepping out once. On the wall behind the counter, the drawing of the brown building with 3 curling rings of smoke now had 6 more pictures taped around it. On the last night of December, the first snow of the season fell over Federal Hill. The cafe closed at 9, and only 2 people remained sitting at the counter. On the wall of photographs, beside the picture taken in August 1994, Margaret had framed another photograph she had printed herself, and she had written on the back in ink, "We told Kowalski and Stefan Vass, 1994, handing over the keys in front of a door that both families, each in their own way, had kept from ever being closed." August looked at it for a while. "They'd think this was sad," he said. "I think they'd think it made perfect sense," Margaret said. He reached across the counter and placed his hand over hers. The small leather notebook lay on the counter between them. "Do you still write in it?" she asked. "I do. What do you write?" He pushed it toward her. She opened it, and the first page of the new section had only 1 line, handwritten in neat script. "List of ingredients to order for next week." The man who had once held the work schedules of 412 people in his hands now had nothing but that notebook, and he sat in the chair at the end of the counter, in a 12-seat cafe, with snow falling outside the window, and for the first time in 15 years, he didn't look toward the door. There are debts people don't repay with money, but by the way they choose to live for the rest of their lives. There are truths that arrive late and hurt, and they can still be kinder than protection, because shielding someone from the truth takes away their right to choose their own life. And in the end, a person isn't defined by everything they did in the dark, but by what they choose on the day they finally have the right to choose. If August and Margaret's story touched something in your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone you think might understand, and subscribe to our channel to listen to more new stories with us every day. We'd truly love to know how this story made you feel, which part made you think the most, and what you would choose if you were in Margaret's position. So please leave a few lines in the comments, and let us hear the honest feelings deep within your heart. May you and your family always have good health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity each day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.